I'm Jill Ehlert, and this is my show, Seaforms, The Nature of Creation, in the Chapel Gallery. And I was lucky enough to be asked to be the first artist in this space, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the way that it looks. White walls, high ceilings, fabulous lighting. It's just absolutely an honor to be here. So my art is inspired by the intertidal zone, the area between high and low tides, and the species that live within that zone. And for my talk, I'm going to tell you first of all about my sources of inspiration, and then I'll talk a little bit about my process and the pieces in the gallery. So I'm lucky enough to go to Ucluelet a few times a year, and I spend a lot of time on Big Beach. And this is an area where it's the wild Pacific coast. Big waves, big action. And I like to tell the story about the barnacle and how the barnacle starts out. And the reason that I want to tell you about this is the different species that we see in this intertidal zone are strong and delicate at the same time. And my work is the same. It's strong and delicate, and I use and choose materials that are a metaphor for that. And this little barnacle starts off as a little tiny speck, as a larva in this big wild water, and it floats around on these sea currents with other little species called zooplankton. And it starts its life out as a head, one eye, and a tail. And it's just floating around, going wherever these little currents will take it. Then it goes through 6 different stages of metamorphosis. So the next thing that happens is this little tiny larva grows an antenna on the top of its head. Now, while this little tiny speck doesn't weigh very much, this antenna is enough that makes it sink slowly down to the substrate, where it starts to crawl along, and this antenna is actually smelling out an area, a location where it can live. So whether it's a hard surface like a whale's back, or a bottom of a boat, or a board or a rock, it will eventually land on that space. And by this time it's formed a cement gland, and it glues its forehead to the rock, and it lives its rest of its life upside down. Then it starts to grow a shell around itself, and it will have 5 or more sides, and it's taking calcium carbonate out of the water to build this little shell. At this time, it starts to get rid of what's called an exoskeleton, its outer shell that's been protecting it, and that falls down into the water, and eventually that will be washed up onto shore. And then this little barnacle will live the rest of its life in this location with this powerful waves that washes over it, and this delicate little shell that's strong enough to withstand that. Other species that are found within this same area are things like kelp that get what's called a holdfast, and it will grow a root system, and it will go around a rock, and that rock is enough of a weight just to hold it down to the bottom so that it can live its life until it starts all over again. The starfish has thousands of little tubular feet that act as suction cups that keep that little species grounded. And mussel shells are another example where it grows hundreds of little fibers that attach to rocks. So at any time we could probably pick up these species and tear them or crush them, but they have this way of being held tight to the ground or the rocks. So that's the environment that amazes me and inspires me. And so I will sketch on site. I'll be out on these rocks sketching. I'll take photographs. I go back into the studio. And the biggest thing I take back with me are feelings of how that's impacted me. And I try to come up with ways to express that. So I would call myself a process artist, that I love to be out in the field, but doing what I call gathering my bundles. I'm gathering the photographs, the images, the feelings, the senses, come back into the studio, and then I do a lot of experimentation. And I'm trying to figure out what medium will best express what I'm feeling inside. And so I'll start playing around with materials. And this is where mixed media comes in for me. So I'll play around with watercolor, gouache, fluid acrylics, gesso, drawing materials, and I'll keep exploring and playing until finally something will come out and I'll think, yes, that's how it feels inside. That's what I want to say. And then I'll do a whole exploration on that. And so that's how a lot of these pieces that are framed under glass began. And I ended up working with a material called washi paper. It's a Japanese paper that's made from 3 different bushes. So the paper looks fragile, you can tear it easily. If it's wet, it almost disintegrates. And yet it's also very, very strong. And so that's a metaphor for these wonderful little species that live in the water, that strength and fragility at the same time. And so with this washi paper, I stain it to begin with fluid acrylics. I have decided a color scheme for the body of work ahead of time. So it's a lot of neutrals, a lot of seafoam, greens, browns, earth tones, a very soft, gentle palette. And I start staining these papers. Then once they're dry, I'll take a wood burning tool and I'll burn holes. And so you can see in this piece here, there's lots of holes burned. And what that represents for me is the way that these species age and go through the life cycle of from growth to decay to deterioration. I'm interested in concepts of transformation and in that life cycle. And when I'm in Ucluelet in the wintertime, there's these enormous seaweed clusters that are thrown up onto the beach. And they ended up in great big tangled masses. And there's colors that you wouldn't believe. And as these seaweeds start to deteriorate, they become richer and the colors become stronger. And the pink seaweed, this is called Turkish Towel. And it is a seaweed that's known as a red seaweed, but in the summertime it looks more black. You can, in the sunshine, as it shines through, you can see a red color within it, but it's mainly black. And then in the wintertime, that black bleaches out and you're left with this hot pink color. And you can almost not even believe that there could be this color. And then that eventually will bleach out and it will become white. So I try to echo those same processes in the work. And I'm working on paper, and I put down the fluid acrylic to begin with, big washes of color to express the water and the fluidity. And then once that's dry, I'll take my washi paper that I've stained and burnt holes in and tear that into shapes and start adhering that to the paper. And then I start drawing and creating these background shapes and images that to me represent these tangled masses. I'm also interested in the beautiful images you see of cellular structures, and sometimes in my research I'll go down to that level. And so this represents cellular structure, the structure of the plant, and the meshing of all of them together. Another thing that I'm also doing to get textures on these is I do a lot of piercing of paper. I have different tools that I can actually push into the paper. And so this area here, for example, you can see the paper pushed out a wee bit, and that's piercing. So these are mark-making tools that I use to help with that expression and the feeling. And so rather than drawing it out, I'm actually altering and changing the paper, trying to echo those same processes that are in nature. So in this show, there are 30 pieces. A few of them began in January in Ucluelet, and that's when something magical happened there, and something I did in the process came through, and it was how I wanted to express it. So I was very excited, came back to the studio and spent all of spring working on the rest of the pieces under glass. And then I began on the pieces that are on the other side of the studio that are stretched paper around cradle board or canvas. And I think that that's a really good example of my process, the sources of inspiration. In the gallery space here, I do have several of examples of the species, dried kelp and kelp root balls, these fabulous barnacles and shells. And also on display in the gallery are books that I've made that are either an exploration into seaweed, the different cellular structures of seaweed, or just artist books where I'm playing around with the tools and the materials. So the show is on until October 31st. The gallery is open Mondays and Saturdays, 10 until 2, and on Wednesdays, 9:30 to 11:30, or by appointment. So if you want to contact Nikki Rendell or myself, Jill Ehlert, we'd be happy to meet you here and talk and discuss the work. So thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.